They said Tallahassee slept peacefully that night. But when the sun rose on April 10, 1852, peace was dead, just like 14 men who had closed their eyes and never opened them again. There was no storm, no warning, no sound in the night. Just sudden, silent death. Part 1. The morning the town stopped breathing. The morning air was heavy in Tallahassee, Florida. It was April 10, 1852, a Saturday, and by dawn, 14 men lay dead across town. Some were found in their beds, beside wives who still dreamed. Others were discovered on quiet dirt roads, their bodies stiff and twisted as if they had fought something unseen. One man was found slumped inside his own carriage, horses still hitched, waiting for a master who would never move again. No one could explain it. No thunderstorm had passed. No sickness had been reported. The town doctor himself was among the dead. These weren't drifters or strangers. They were men everyone knew, farmers, merchants, a lawyer, a banker, and even Father Prescott Reed, the priest at St. Anne's Church. By 6 that morning, Sheriff Helmer Gray was woken by pounding at his door. He opened it to find a young messenger, face pale, trembling. "Sheriff, it's Mr. Doherty, the warehouse owner." His wife found him dead on the floor. Gray grabbed his hat, his revolver, and rode straight into town. The Doherty house stood near the cotton docks. When he entered, he found Mary Doherty weeping on the floor beside her husband's body. The man's skin had turned pale blue. His hands were curled tight like claws. The air smelled of sour vomit and blood. Mary kept sobbing. He came home late, around 11. Said he wasn't feeling well. He vomited, and then he just fell. Her voice cracked. He was shaking, and then he stopped moving. Gray crouched beside the body. There were no wounds, no bruises. It didn't look like murder, but it didn't look like sickness either. Before he could ask another question, another rider came galloping down the road. His horse was covered in sweat. "Sheriff, the bank manager, Mr. Ewell, he's dead too." Found at his gate, stiff as wood. Gray's stomach tightened. 2 dead men, both respected, both found the same morning, both with the same strange signs. He mounted up and rode the 3 miles to Ewell's property. The banker's body lay beside his horse, frozen in an awful posture. His face was contorted in fear, eyes open, mouth rigid. Ewell's wife told Gray her husband had gone out around 7 the night before. He hadn't said where he was going. Around midnight, the horse came galloping back alone. They found him near the gate at dawn, dead before he could reach home. By 8 o'clock, Gray had lost count of the messengers arriving from every direction. A cotton farmer and his teenage son, both found dead in their barn. A lawyer discovered on a narrow country road, sprawled in the dust. Then came the most shocking report. "Father Reed," said Deputy Collins, pale and sweating. "He's dead. Found inside St. Anne's Church. The doctor's body is there too, Dr. Brennan." Gray felt a chill run down his back. The doctor was supposed to help explain this. Now he was gone too. Gray spurred his horse and headed west, toward the edge of town where St. Anne stood alone against a backdrop of empty fields and whispering pine trees. The church was quiet when he arrived, its wooden cross casting a long shadow in the morning light. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the pews were neat, the air still heavy with the scent of candle wax and incense. Near the altar, Gray saw them. Father Reed lay on his side, one arm outstretched, as though he'd been reaching for something, or someone. Dr. Brennan was beside him, lying on his back, mouth open, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Gray knelt to inspect them. Again, no wounds, no signs of struggle, just the same unnatural stiffness, the same pale bluish hue. But something else caught his eye, drag marks on the floor. He traced them with his lantern. The marks started at a side corridor and ended near the altar, as though something, or someone, had been dragged across the floor. There were stains too. Dark, sticky stains that could have been vomit or blood. The priest hadn't died there. He'd been moved, or had moved himself. Gray followed the trail down the corridor. It led outside, to a small building behind the church, a meeting house used for small gatherings. The structure looked worn, half repaired from hurricane damage years ago. The side door was open. Inside, chaos. Chairs overturned. Empty whiskey bottles on the table. Dirty glasses scattered everywhere. Someone had been there. Many people, and they'd left in a hurry. Gray moved through the main hall and checked the small back rooms. 3 contained beds, sheets unmade and dirty. The 4th door was locked. He tried the handle. It rattled but didn't open. He knocked once. Silence. Then, a faint sound from inside. A scrape, like wood against wood. Gray's hand went to his revolver. "This is Sheriff Gray," he said. "If someone's in there, speak now." Nothing. He took a step back and slammed his boot against the door. The wood cracked, then broke open. The smell that came out was worse than anything he'd encountered that morning, something rotten and metallic. The room was small, with no windows. In the middle stood a table covered with papers, bottles, and a strange wooden box with metal hinges. The box was open. Gray stepped closer. Inside it were small glass vials, some broken, others still full of dark liquid. He reached for one carefully. The label was smeared, but he could still make out 2 words, compound number 17. A single candle had burned down to a puddle of wax beside it. Gray felt the hairs rise on his arms. Whatever had killed those 14 men, had started here. He didn't yet know why those men had gathered that night, or what Father Reed had been protecting, but as he stared at that box, he realized something terrible. This wasn't random. It was planned. And St. Anne's Church wasn't just a house of God anymore, it was a house of death. End of part 1. Would you like me to continue with part 2, where Sheriff Gray begins uncovering what compound number 17 really was and how it ties to the priest's secret experiments beneath the church? Title: The Secret Beneath St. Anne's, Part 2, Engaging Hook. When Sheriff Helmer Gray broke that last locked door behind St. Anne's Church, he thought he was ready for anything. He'd seen murder before. He'd seen bodies. But what he found inside that small, dark room would haunt him for the rest of his life, and reveal just how deep the church's evil truly ran. Part 2, The Locked Room. The smell hit Gray before the door was even open: sweat, alcohol, and something else he couldn't name. The 4th room of the annex was locked from the outside, a thick iron bolt sealing it tight. He called for his deputy, then forced the bolt loose with a hard strike from his shoulder. The door swung open, and Gray's heart nearly stopped. 3 women were chained to the wall. Chains connected to iron rings buried deep into the wood. The women were barely clothed, covered only by torn rags. 2 of them sobbed quietly. The 3rd just stared ahead, her eyes empty, her mind somewhere far beyond that room. Gray stepped back, swallowing hard. "Get blankets," he ordered his deputies. "And tools. We're breaking these chains." While the men hurried off, he walked deeper into the room, lantern trembling in his hand. The walls were covered in marks, deep scratches where fingernails had broken against wood. There were dark stains that could only be blood. The air was thick with rot and fear. When one of the women turned slightly, Gray froze. Burn marks covered her back, forming words. In the dim glow, he read them clearly. Church property. He clenched his fists. His stomach twisted. These women had been tortured, owned. When the chains were finally cut and the women wrapped in blankets, Gray ordered every inch of the building searched. What they found was worse than anything he had imagined. Empty chains in other rooms. Whips. Leather straps. Metal tools whose purpose was too cruel to describe. In one corner, a pile of women's clothes, ripped dresses, broken shoes, pieces of jewelry, all stained and discarded. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a system, a place built for cruelty. In the main hall, Gray found a long table, large enough for 15 men. Wax stains from candles, cigar ashes, half-empty bottles. Under a chair, a small glass vial. He picked it up carefully. It was empty, but a white residue clung to the bottom. He sniffed it, nothing. But the vial's size and shape were familiar. Rat poison, arsenic. Gray's mind started connecting the pieces. Deputy Levi, the youngest of the group, began speaking softly to the 3 freed women. They were terrified, barely able to answer, but eventually words began to come. Their names were Molly, Hannah, and Joanna. They belonged to the church. They had worked for Father Prescott Reed. That night, there had been a gathering. The same men who now lay dead across Tallahassee had been there, drinking, laughing, doing unspeakable things. Then, sometime near midnight, everything changed. Molly said the drinks had been served by two other women, Clara and Elizabeth. Then the men started coughing, vomiting, falling to the floor. When Gray asked where Clara and Elizabeth were now, Molly's answer was simple. They disappeared. Gone into the night. Gray felt a cold understanding settle in his gut. The men had been poisoned, almost certainly with arsenic. The priest and doctor had died trying to cover it up. But this wasn't just a case of revenge or justice. It was the eruption of something buried deep, something the whole town had tried not to see. He sent out 2 search teams immediately, men with dogs, to hunt for the missing women. They couldn't have gotten far. But even as the search began, Gray knew that whatever he found next would shake the town to its core. By noon, word had spread. 14 men dead, the priest among them. Strange things found at the church. Crowds gathered in the streets. Women whispered from porches. Children were pulled indoors. Every rumor made the story worse, and still the truth was darker than anyone dared to speak. Gray sealed the annex. Only his most trusted deputies were allowed near it. Because this was more than a crime, it was a scandal. A sickness that reached into every corner of Tallahassee's so-called respectability. That evening, as the sun sank red behind the pines, Gray returned to the priest's small residence beside the church. He needed to know who Father Reed really was. Inside, everything looked neat and orderly, but when he began opening drawers and trunks, a very different man began to appear. He found ledgers, letters, and diaries. One book looked like an account ledger, handwritten lines listing roof repairs, purchase of pews, and vestry maintenance. The dates were neat, the amounts precise. But something was off. The same types of repairs appeared twice a week, always on Tuesdays and Fridays. And the amounts, $30, $45, $60, were far too large for simple church work. Gray frowned. These aren't repairs, he muttered. They're codes. He took the ledger with him. Along with a second book, a personal diary filled with twisted theology. Pages of scripture rewritten to justify slavery, cruelty, and sin. Father Reed had built his own religion, one where suffering was sanctified and power was holy. By the time night fell, Gray had pieced together part of the puzzle. 14 men had gathered in that annex. They drank. They died. 2 women served the drinks and vanished. The priest had tried to hide the evidence, but died before he could finish. The next morning, April 11th, Gray brought in an accountant from St. Augustine, a man with no ties to Tallahassee. Within an hour, the truth emerged. The repairs in the ledger weren't repairs at all. They were events. Roof repair meant a full night with all participants. Purchase of pews meant smaller gatherings. Vestry repairs were special nights with extra services. Over 2 years, from 1850 to 1852, there had been more than 280 of those gatherings. Each man paid $3 to $5. 15 men per night, twice a week. Gray did the math. Over $11,000 had passed through the church's hands, earned in blood, pain, and silence. The sheriff sat back, the ledger open on his lap. The lamp flickered beside him. The church hadn't just hidden evil. It had profited from it. And the 2 missing women, Clara and Elizabeth, the only living witnesses, were now running for their lives. Gray looked toward the window, where the first light of dawn touched the steeple of St. Anne's. He knew this was far from over. Because the deeper he dug, the clearer it became. Those 14 men hadn't been the only ones involved. They were just the beginning. End of part 2. Would you like me to continue with part 3, where Clara and Elizabeth's trail leads to an abandoned plantation and the town's secrets begin to unravel in terrifying ways? Title: The Secret Beneath St. Anne's, Part 3. Engaging hook. The bodies were only the beginning. As Sheriff Helmer Gray dug deeper, he realized that what happened at St. Anne's Church wasn't a single night of horror. It was an organized system, a secret network of wealth, control, and unspeakable crimes, and it had been quietly shaping Tallahassee for years. Part 3. The hidden network. The fortune was staggering. Over $11,000 in 2 years, money built on human suffering. Each coin represented chains, burned flesh, and obedience forced by fear and distorted theology. Gray felt the weight of the ledger in his hands. It wasn't just a record of money, it was a roadmap of cruelty. Molly, Hannah, and Joanna were questioned again, this time carefully, slowly, to avoid overwhelming them. Through hours of patient observation, Gray and his deputies reconstructed the timeline. At first, the gatherings had been small. Just a handful of men, a few nights, simple and secret. But over time, the operation grew. In the months leading up to April 1852, roughly 30 men participated in rotation. No more than 15 per night. Always on Tuesdays and Fridays. The system had become mechanical, predictable, unbroken for 2 years. Molly, the eldest, revealed the grim history of the women involved. A slave named Joan had been there at the start. She died in 1850. Officially from fever, but the silence from Molly and the shadows in her eyes said the truth was far darker. Clara and Elizabeth arrived later. Along with them, the others, the 5 women who had rotated through the house over time. 3 were now chained, 2 had disappeared. Hannah, visibly shaken, revealed a secret that chilled Gray to the bone. She had been pregnant. Her baby, born in January 1852, had been healthy. She had never seen him again. Father Reed claimed he would arrange adoption by a family in Jacksonville, but no. Records confirmed this. The midwife, an elderly woman named Margaret, confirmed assisting the birth. Father Reed had taken the child away immediately, insisting it had a family waiting. The baby had never been baptized, never officially existed. Another boy, born in 1851 to Clara, had met the same fate. The horror was compounded by financial exploitation. Joanna eventually described a market for women in certain conditions. Some men paid extra for women who were pregnant, $5 or $6 instead of the normal $3, creating a cruel economic system around the physical states of the women. Pregnancy, suffering, and obedience were monetized. Gray brought in a priest from a neighboring parish to read the theological diary. The visitor's face darkened as he read. Reed had twisted scripture to justify cruelty. Citing Genesis, he argued that descendants of Ham were divinely destined to serve. Women had a specific purpose, to satisfy men. He referenced Abraham and Hagar, Jacob and Bilhah, stripping context to rationalize horror. But the abuse was not only financial and physical. Reed had indoctrinated the women. Molly explained how he conducted private sermons for the slaves, reciting distorted verses, forcing them to kneel, teaching that resistance was sin. Obedience and suffering were presented as divine trials. Chains of faith were as strong as the iron ones on the walls. Neighbors provided critical observations. One elderly woman recalled carriages parked at strange hours on Tuesday and Friday nights, 5 or 6 vehicles, lights in the annex when no meetings were scheduled. A nearby farmer confirmed lights and movement, attributing them to church activities. A merchant had sold vast amounts of whiskey to the parish, assuming it was for sacramental purposes. The quantity over 2 years exceeded any legitimate use by tenfold. Gray began connecting social networks. The dead were not isolated. The cotton farmer often seen with the warehouse owner and lawyer. The bank manager worked with Dr. Brennan. Social, commercial, and familial ties suggested a coordinated group. A breakthrough came with a forgotten letter discovered in a rarely opened drawer at the sheriff's office. Dated February 1852, it denounced activities at St. Anne's. Women were held against their will. Important men were implicated. The letter had been read, filed, and ignored. A laundress eventually identified the handwriting as similar to Catherine, a prostitute in town. Catherine and another woman, Agnes, had worked at the church intermittently, paid to provide services, but tightly controlled economically by the priest. They lived in constant dependence. Unlike the slaves, they were not chained, but their freedom was illusory. Receipts for slave purchases revealed chilling objectification. Clara, Elizabeth, and Molly had been acquired for prices ranging from $700 to $750, described in margins with terms like adequate appearance, excellent choice, premium investment. One woman had been replaced for being inadequate, treated as merchandise. Gray found a frequency record of participation, 30 entries, numbers beside each name indicating nights attended. 14 dead, 15 survivors. Each number confirmed participation in a cycle of ritualized abuse. Interrogations revealed the scale of complicity. The surviving men were terrified: farmers, merchants, lawyers. They begged for discretion, offering money, promising to leave town. The so-called Tallahassee Gentlemen's Club had operated like a legitimate enterprise, absolute protection guaranteed by the priest. Clara and Elizabeth had changed everything. Arsenic in the drinks on April 9 led to 14 deaths. The priest died trying to conceal evidence. Richard Porter, the only survivor, voluntarily came forward on April 12. He described the night in detail. 15 men present: farmers, merchants, professionals. 3 boys aged 14 to 16 were present, initiated into the horrors as if it were a rite of manhood. Porter arrived late, saw the women serving drinks, and noticed symptoms first in Dr. Brennan: nausea, collapse. Porter fled, vomiting on the road, the only one to survive. The scale of the crime was unprecedented. 14 dead, multiple survivors complicit, the priest's twisted theology codifying decades of abuse, 2 missing women, children taken, economic exploitation, psychological control, and a generation being groomed into normalization of atrocity. Gray faced an impossible choice. 15 living participants, all respected men, with families and businesses, risked a public trial that would shatter Tallahassee's social fabric. Before he could act, the unthinkable happened. A deputy revealed to a visiting journalist that Gray himself had attended some gatherings in 1851, 5 or 6 times. Public trust shattered instantly. Gray denied it, threatened the deputy and the reporter, but corroboration emerged. Shock had been performance. He knew exactly what was happening in the annex. Public pressure became unbearable. Families demanded impartial investigation. On April 18, Gray resigned and fled to Georgia. He never faced charges. Temporary Sheriff Jefferson Johns, from a neighboring county, assumed command. Detached from the town's networks, he began uncovering layers of corruption and horror Gray had left behind. The archives became his first target. And there, in the dusty ledgers and letters, the story of St. Anne's was only just beginning. End of Part 3. I can continue with Part 4, where Sheriff Johns uncovers the extent of the network, including how the next generation was being groomed into the club and the fates of Clara and Elizabeth. Do you want me to continue? Title: The Secret Beneath St. Anne's, Part 4, Engaging Hook. When Sheriff Jefferson Johns took over the investigation of St. Anne's Church, he thought he was seeing the worst of human depravity. But the horrors he uncovered went beyond murder, chains, and corrupted clergy. There was a system in place, decades of manipulation, cruelty, and the grooming of a next generation who had never known innocence. What he found would leave Tallahassee forever changed. Part 4, The Generations of Horror. Sheriff Jefferson Johns arrived at St. Anne's Church on April 19, 1852, stepping into a town still reeling from the poisonings and the scandal of Helmer Gray's departure. Unlike Gray, Johns had no connections here. He was an outsider, impartial, and methodical. From the first glance at the annex, he could feel the heavy history embedded in its walls, pain, suffering, and secrecy that had thrived for years. He began where Gray had left off: the archives, ledgers, and diaries. The leather-bound books smelled of age and neglect. One book, in particular, stood out, a thick ledger recording not just finances, but every gathering, participant, and payment. Johns' eyes scanned pages where shorthand codes masked human suffering. Roof repair, vestry repairs, purchase of pews. Numbers scribbled beside each name, tallying participation like a grotesque attendance sheet. This was no casual crime. It was a well-organized system. A network of men, farmers, merchants, lawyers, even the town's physician, who had participated for years, shielded by the priest's authority and a culture of silence. The ledger suggested at least 280 gatherings over 2 years. Each participant had a number indicating nights attended, fees paid, and services rendered. But Johns wanted more than numbers. He wanted to understand the full scope of human cost. He returned to the 3 surviving slaves, Molly, Hannah, and Joanna. Carefully, he spoke to them about the nights they had spent in chains, the punishments they endured, and the rituals forced upon them. Hannah's story pierced through his understanding of evil. She described her pregnancy, the birth of her son in January 1852, and how Father Reed had immediately taken the baby away. There were no records, no baptism, no trace of life beyond the priest's claim of adoption. Clara had also given birth in 1851, another boy taken the same way. John's stomach churned. This wasn't just abuse, it was erasure. Human lives removed, forgotten, never acknowledged. Molly explained the rotations of women in the annex. 5 had passed through in total. Some had died, some were missing, and 2, Clara and Elizabeth, were unaccounted for since the night of April 9. The 3 remaining women had lived through horrors that defied imagination, forced to internalize the priest's warped theology. Johns reviewed the priest's diary with fresh eyes. Reed had created a doctrine that rationalized suffering as divine will. Biblical passages were twisted to justify slavery, abuse, and obedience. Obedience was sanctified. Resistance was sin. Women, particularly, were taught that their suffering pleased God. Each lecture, each verse, was a psychological chain. Johns took a walk outside, breathing in the early morning air heavy with tension. He spoke to neighbors, trying to reconstruct the rhythm of life around the church. One elderly woman confirmed what Gray had heard: carriages arriving late at night on Tuesdays and Fridays. Lights in the annex, presumed to be church gatherings, were anything but. A nearby farmer, initially reluctant, admitted to seeing men arrive with young boys, children aged 14 to 16. They were brought to learn, he said quietly, avoiding eye contact. 2. Participate. To become men. Johns shivered. This wasn't just cruelty, it was indoctrination. The horror was being passed down. Fathers had normalized it for sons, creating a cycle that could continue for generations. Records from the priest's residence corroborated this. Receipts for slave purchases, notes about physical attributes, and frequency records of participation painted a picture of complete objectification. Clara, Elizabeth, and Molly were considered commodities. Margins of ledgers contained chilling terms: premium investment, adequate appearance, excellent choice. The business of suffering was precise, calculated, and profitable. Next, Johns focused on the surviving men. 14 were dead, 15 remained alive. Names cross-referenced with ledger entries, witnesses, and local observations revealed a terrifying network of complicity. These were not mere participants, they were protectors of the system. They had attended gatherings, paid fees, and reinforced a cycle of abuse and secrecy. Johns called the first survivor, a local merchant, into his temporary office. The man was pale, sweating, visibly terrified. Under quiet questioning, he admitted to participation. He had attended multiple gatherings, watched abuse, and paid the fees. He insisted he never saw the full horror, never suspected the scale, but his words rang hollow. More interviews followed. Each man had his own version, each claiming ignorance, each begging for discretion. Some offered money, others suggested leaving town. All feared public exposure. The town's social fabric was fragile, and these confessions threatened to destroy it entirely. Then there was Richard Porter, the only survivor from April 9. Porter's testimony reconstructed the night in harrowing detail. 15 men arrived, including teenagers. Whiskey flowed, laughter echoed, but soon, the first signs of poisoning emerged. Vomiting, convulsions, collapse. Panic spread. Father Reed, realizing the disaster, tried to drag victims inside the church, perhaps to conceal evidence, but he too fell. Porter fled, vomiting along the road, the sole living witness. Clara and Elizabeth had vanished during the chaos. Their disappearance was precise, almost orchestrated. Porter insisted he hadn't seen them add poison, yet every detail indicated the timing was intentional. Johns reviewed letters, ledgers, and diaries. Anonymous correspondence revealed that the system had been denounced as early as February 1852. A letter had been sent to the sheriff, detailing women held against their will and the participation of prominent men. It had been filed and ignored. Catherine and Agnes, prostitutes involved in occasional church work, had disappeared the same night as the poisonings. Were they acting independently or under instructions? Johns didn't know yet. The new sheriff realized the challenge wasn't just finding Clara and Elizabeth or identifying the men, it was dismantling an entire culture of secrecy. The operation had operated with astonishing regularity, protected by authority, fear, and incredulity. As he prepared for the next stage of the investigation, Johns knew that uncovering the truth would be just the beginning. The real question was how a town could live with the knowledge that a system of abuse, indoctrination, and exploitation had operated in plain sight for years. And worse, how many more children had been drawn into it, unknowingly trained to accept horror as tradition. Johns turned back to the ledger, his mind racing. The pattern was clear, but the next steps would be delicate. Each decision could bring justice, or shatter the lives of those still living. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over St. Anne's. The church steeple loomed like a silent witness to decades of darkness. The investigation had just begun, and the next discoveries would reveal secrets that even Jefferson Johns was not prepared for. End of Part 4. I can continue with Part 5, where the fates of Clara and Elizabeth are revealed and the investigation uncovers deeper corruption among Tallahassee's elite. Do you want me to continue? Title: The Secret Beneath St. Anne's, Part 5, Engaging Hook. By mid-April 1852, Tallahassee was a city holding its breath. Sheriff Jefferson Johns had begun peeling back layers of corruption and horror hidden in plain sight for years. But some truths were darker than even he imagined. The fate of the missing women, the surviving club members, and the town itself would now be tested. What Johns discovered next would shatter illusions of safety and morality forever. Part 5, The Vanished and the Verdict. Sheriff Jefferson Johns began April 20th with a single objective: find Clara and Elizabeth. Without the two women, the chain of events that had led to 14 deaths could not be fully understood. They were not just witnesses, they were actors, survivors, and possibly victims of a larger system. The sheriff divided his deputies into search parties. One scoured the woods north of the church, another went along the river, where small boats could have ferried them away. Johns himself returned to the town, speaking quietly to tavern owners, stable hands, and anyone who might have noticed strange movements on the night of April 9th. It was at a small riverside wharf that a breakthrough arrived. An old ferryman remembered seeing two young women, both dark-haired, moving cautiously along the banks early Saturday morning. They had been carrying small bundles and avoided his gaze. They looked scared, sir, the man said. They kept to the shadows. Didn't answer me when I called. Johns immediately dispatched a deputy to follow the river path. Within hours, they discovered a hidden shack several miles outside town. Its walls were patched with old boards, and smoke curled from a makeshift chimney. Inside, Clara and Elizabeth huddled together, frightened but alive. The sheriff approached slowly, hands raised in a gesture of calm. "You're safe now," he said. The women clung to each other, tears streaming. Clara whispered, "They'll come for us." Johns understood immediately. Their fear was not just of the men who had died, it was of the powerful network that had operated for years, still hiding in plain sight. Johns brought the women to the sheriff's temporary office in town. He offered blankets and warm drinks. Once their nerves had settled, he began a careful interrogation, mindful not to re-traumatize them. Elizabeth spoke first. "We didn't know it would happen," she said. "The priest, he told us to serve the men, to follow the instructions. But the poison, we didn't put it in the drinks. We didn't know." Clara confirmed. "We served them whiskey like always. Then, everything changed. People fell. Father Reed, he tried to help, and then he was gone. We ran." Johns realized the full significance. The women had been coerced into complicity. They were trained for obedience and compliance, but they were not killers. Their actions were survival. The sheriff also learned more about the social structure behind the horrors. Each surviving club member had connections, power, and influence. Some had families, some held public offices, some owned land, and some controlled commerce. Any public trial could destroy the city, incite riots, and potentially spark violence. Johns knew discretion was necessary, but justice still needed to be served. He convened a small council of trusted officials and lawyers from outside Tallahassee to strategize. Evidence needed to be preserved, but the proceedings had to be controlled. Meanwhile, Clara and Elizabeth revealed something else. Father Reed had not acted alone in the theological indoctrination of the slaves. Some surviving men had participated, instructing the women, enforcing obedience, and silently witnessing abuse. They had helped maintain the system, legitimized by fear, power, and silence. The sheriff realized that uncovering the remaining network would require subtlety and cunning. He began comparing ledger entries with property records, correspondence, and eyewitness accounts. Slowly, he built a map of relationships connecting the surviving club members. He also sought the families of the victims. Confronting them with the details of what had occurred was delicate. Parents of teenagers who had attended the gatherings were devastated. Husbands and wives of the deceased struggled to understand how men they had trusted could be involved in such atrocities. Despite the delicate politics, Johns was determined. He ordered controlled arrests of the surviving men. One by one, they were taken from their homes quietly, interrogated, and confronted with evidence. Some confessed immediately. Others attempted denial, but the combination of witness testimony, ledger evidence, and physical artifacts from the annex left no room for doubt. The confessions revealed additional horrors. Men who had never been violent publicly had participated in orchestrating punishments, instructing the slaves, and ensuring secrecy. Some had witnessed abuses of a sexual nature, yet done nothing. Others had coerced or encouraged the younger boys in attendance to normalize these actions. Johns documented everything meticulously. He knew that even if prosecutions were limited, future generations had to understand the truth. The system had been deliberate, planned, and ongoing for years. The discovery of the two women alive allowed Johns to reconstruct the fatal night of April 9. Completely. They provided insight into the timing of the poison, the reactions of the victims, and the exact moment when the priest had died. They also described subtle signals between the men that revealed complicity and shared responsibility. It became clear that the poisonings were not a random act of vengeance. They were a calculated risk, perhaps a rebellion of the enslaved women, an attempt to break free from the control of the priest and his loyal participants. 14 deaths were the tragic consequence. Johns also had to consider the future. He recommended that Clara, Elizabeth, Molly, Hannah, and Joanna be protected and relocated. They could not safely remain in Tallahassee. Too many of the surviving men still wielded influence. He petitioned the governor for their transfer to a safe location where they could rebuild their lives. By April 25, the surviving club members were under surveillance. Authorities had agreed on a strategy. Public disclosure would be selective. Key confessions would be recorded, and fines, property confiscation, and private sanctions would be imposed. Full public trials could be held later if necessary, but the immediate goal was preventing further abuse. The citizens of Tallahassee remained unaware of the full extent of the horror. Rumors circulated, but the magnitude of the crimes would only be revealed gradually. Johns understood that the psychological impact of disclosure had to be managed. Families had to retain their dignity where possible, while the guilty faced accountability. In the weeks that followed, Clara and Elizabeth began to recover. They told their story quietly, slowly, building trust with authorities and each other. The other women, Molly, Hannah, and Joanna, received care, and their traumatic experiences were documented for historical record. Johns reflected on the power of fear and silence. The system had thrived because no one had questioned authority, no one had investigated rumors, and no one had challenged the priest's moral control. Now, those layers were unraveling. By the end of Part 5, Tallahassee faced a pivotal moment: justice, secrecy, or both. Clara and Elizabeth were alive, but the city had only begun to reckon with the consequences of its collective blindness and complicity. The question remained: How many others had been drawn into the network, and what would happen when their stories emerged? If you want, I can continue with Part 6, where the investigation dives deeper into the financial network, the elite participants, and the shocking revelations that tie powerful families to St. Anne's horrors. Do you want me to continue? Title: The Secret Beneath St. Anne's, Part 6. Engaging hook. Tallahassee had survived the shock of 14 sudden deaths, but the truth lurking behind the church walls was far from over. As Sheriff Jefferson Johns dug deeper, he realized that the horror extended beyond poison and chains. It was a system of wealth, influence, and silent complicity. What he uncovered next would expose not just criminals, but an entire community bound by fear, secrets, and greed. Part 6. Web of Influence. By early May 1852, the investigation had shifted from immediate crime scenes to the hidden structures that had allowed the horrors at St. Anne's to continue unchecked. Sheriff Johns spent hours examining ledger books, diaries, letters, and church records. Each page revealed the meticulous planning behind gatherings that had claimed lives and destroyed innocence. The ledger entries that had initially seemed like ordinary church expenses now made sense in a sinister context. Roof repairs, pew purchases, and vestry renovations were codes. Each entry corresponded to specific gatherings, fees collected, and participants' names. The arithmetic was cold and precise. Each man paid a fee for his involvement, generating significant income over 2 years. Some payments were larger, depending on additional demands or specific preferences. Johns realized this was not just an abuse of power but a calculated, profitable enterprise. The priest had been both architect and enforcer, using religion to justify and perpetuate his control. Johns also began investigating financial connections. The deceased warehouse owner had recently transferred a portion of his assets to an unknown party. The bank manager's accounts showed irregular withdrawals that coincided with meeting nights. These were not accidents, they were payments for services hidden behind the veneer of respectability. The surviving club members had wealth, influence, and social standing. Some owned plantations, others were merchants or professionals. All had invested in the operation either through fees or by protecting it. Exposing them publicly could destroy Tallahassee's economy and reputation. Johns needed a careful approach. He began discreet interrogations, comparing witness statements, ledger entries, and property records. Gradually, a network of complicity emerged. Some men had only participated once or twice. Others were deeply involved, enforcing rules and teaching younger generations. Teenagers observed their father's behavior, normalizing abuse and control. The theological diary found in the priest's private study provided context for the psychological manipulation. Father Reed had created a distorted moral framework. Slaves and women under his control were taught that suffering was divinely ordained. The surviving women confirmed the indoctrination. Johns knew the public could not immediately handle the full scale of this revelation. Families of participants, influential citizens, and city officials were implicated. The strategy was to document evidence, secure the survivors, and gradually bring those responsible to account. The sheriff also focused on the fate of missing women. Clara and Elizabeth had been hidden for days, fearful for their lives. Once in protective custody, they provided crucial testimony. They confirmed that the poisonings on April 9 were deliberate, likely intended as revenge or a desperate attempt at liberation. Their description of the fatal night matched the physical evidence. Whiskey bottles, empty glasses, overturned chairs, and drag marks told the same story. The priest had tried to intervene but succumbed to the effects of the poison. The women had fled immediately, vanishing into the darkness, and their absence explained why the victims had no chance to recover. Johns also discovered letters between some surviving members. They referenced past gatherings, strategies to prevent exposure, and instructions on dealing with non-compliant participants. One letter, unsigned but clearly written by a member with legal knowledge, warned others to ensure loyalty or risk ruin. The language was cold and calculated. While the sheriff pieced together the financial and social framework, he also had to manage public reaction. Rumors ran wild. Stories of 14 dead men and a corrupt priest circulated, often exaggerated. Johns decided on measured disclosure. Facts confirmed, rumors dismissed, and a promise of justice. Meanwhile, deputies located additional evidence in storage rooms within the annex. Objects used in the abuse of slaves were catalogued. Burn marks, scars, and chains confirmed systematic cruelty. Letters and coded notes suggested that more women had been brought into the network over time, some purchased, others coerced. Johns held daily briefings with his trusted team. Strategies included tracing all financial records, mapping connections, and preparing for legal proceedings. He also coordinated with external authorities to ensure impartiality and prevent tampering with evidence. One of the most disturbing discoveries involved the younger participants. Teenage sons of deceased and surviving members had attended gatherings under the guise of education or mentorship. They observed abuse, learned rules, and were subtly indoctrinated. Johns realized the horror was generational, designed to continue. The sheriff took special care documenting every confession, every ledger entry, and every physical trace. He knew that even if prosecutions were delayed or partial, a permanent record was necessary. Future historians, investigators, and citizens would need the truth. By mid-May, a pattern of complicity was clear. The priest had centralized control. Men paid for entry. Some enforced compliance. Others facilitated logistics. Families of participants turned a blind eye, or worse, indirectly supported the operation. The surviving women, slowly recovering, were moved to a safe location outside Tallahassee. Their stories were recorded in full. Each detail, each date, each transaction painted a clearer picture of the scope of corruption. Johns also considered the city itself. Tallahassee had been unknowingly complicit. Merchants, clergy, and officials had ignored unusual patterns, deferred to authority, and assumed appearances reflected morality. The poisonings, the chains, and the deaths were the final catalyst forcing the city to confront its hidden darkness. By the end of Part 6, Sheriff Johns understood one undeniable truth: Street Anne's horrors were not the work of one man or 14 men. They were the result of a tightly controlled, multi-layered system of abuse, commerce, and indoctrination. The next step would be the most difficult: deciding who would face justice, how it would be carried out, and how Tallahassee could survive the revelation that its moral heart had been corrupted for years. If you want, I can continue with Part 7, where the investigation escalates, exposing secret rituals, the full extent of the surviving members' guilt, and shocking ties to other influential families in Tallahassee. Do you want me to continue with Part 7? Title: The Secret Beneath Street Anne's, Part 7, Engaging Hook. Tallahassee had survived 14 sudden deaths, but the darkness behind Street Anne's church was far from over. Sheriff Jefferson Johns had uncovered a web of control, abuse, and wealth that implicated the city's most respected men. Yet the deeper he dug, the more horrifying truths emerged. What he found next would reveal not only the full scale of the priest's crimes but also the secret rituals and alliances that had bound the town in silence for years. Part 7, Secrets in the Shadows. By early June 1852, Sheriff Johns had a clear understanding of the financial and social network behind the horrors at St. Anne's. Yet one question haunted him: how had such a system operated for years without detection? The ledger books, diaries, and letters painted one part of the picture, but rumors, whispers, and testimonies suggested a deeper, ritualistic side that had gone unnoticed. Johns began interviewing former servants, parishioners, and anyone who might have been tangentially involved. Slowly, a pattern emerged: special gatherings beyond the standard Tuesday and Friday nights. These were private events attended only by the most trusted and wealthy participants. Clara and Elizabeth described certain nights where the priest performed private rituals. Candles were arranged in circles, chants recited, and symbols drawn on floors. Women were made to kneel, men observed silently, and certain participants were singled out for special attention. These gatherings were both ceremonial and secretive, designed to cement loyalty and instill fear. The sheriff cross-referenced these accounts with diary entries. One passage described a purification night, where men and women were instructed to confess sins aloud before the priest. Another noted the use of wine, incense, and scripted prayers, all masking the true purpose: control and indoctrination. Johns realized that the priest had crafted not just a system of exploitation but a religion of obedience tailored to his desires. Meanwhile, evidence surfaced that surviving members had enforced these rituals themselves. Some had been responsible for monitoring behavior, ensuring that no one deviated from the rules, and that the women remained compliant. It became clear that complicity extended beyond attendance. It was active participation in abuse and psychological domination. Johns discovered letters between club members discussing hierarchy, rewards, and punishments. A code of conduct existed, dictating behavior, who could be initiated, and how loyalty was verified. Younger men were taught to observe, mimic, and enforce the priest's directives. It was a system designed to perpetuate itself across generations. The investigation also revealed that not all clergy had been complicit. A few neighboring priests had grown suspicious but had been silenced by fear of scandal or threats of violence. One anonymous note from 1851 warned a visiting cleric not to investigate street ands further, implying severe consequences. This note confirmed that secrecy had been maintained through intimidation as well as influence. In parallel, Sheriff Johns traced financial records in more depth. Payments were not limited to standard fees. Some men provided special offerings, often recorded as maintenance costs or charitable donations, masking sums exchanged for access to the women or participation in secret rituals. Further complicating matters, he discovered that certain families outside Tallahassee had been involved. Letters from businessmen in nearby counties hinted at similar gatherings, implying a network extending beyond the city. The priest had connections that reached influential circles in the state, making the potential exposure of the operation even more dangerous. Johns began conducting late-night interviews, speaking with men who had previously denied involvement. As pressure mounted, confessions grew more detailed. Some men admitted to teaching boys during the gatherings, normalizing abuse and obedience. Others described enforcing rules with threats, intimidation, and occasional violence. The chilling reality was that a new generation had been indoctrinated to view such horrors as acceptable. The sheriff also focused on the psychological damage suffered by the women. Molly, Hannah, Clara, Elizabeth, and Joanna had endured years of manipulation and control. Each interview revealed layers of trauma, forced compliance, threats, and coercion disguised as religious or moral duty. Johns documented these testimonies carefully, aware that they would be central to any future proceedings. Meanwhile, the city's elite watched anxiously. Business owners, officials, and families of the surviving club members feared public exposure. Rumors of the priest's rituals, combined with ledger evidence and confessions, threatened to dismantle reputations and fortunes. Johns knew discretion was crucial, balancing the pursuit of justice with the need to prevent mob violence or economic collapse. In the archives, Johns discovered photographs, sketches, and notes detailing the layout of the annex and ritual spaces. Symbols marked floors, walls, and furniture. Candles, small altars, and hidden compartments indicated meticulous planning. These objects, combined with witness testimony, confirmed that rituals had been conducted with both precision and secrecy. An unexpected breakthrough came when the sheriff discovered a hidden cache beneath the church floorboards. In a small compartment were letters, receipts, and personal notes from men and women involved in past gatherings. Some documents referenced payments, threats, and punishments. Others described escape attempts, secret warnings, and a growing awareness among certain participants that the priest's system was unsustainable. Johns realized that exposure was inevitable. The priest was dead, several men had already died or been poisoned, and survivors were frightened but willing to testify under protection. The system could no longer function. Yet the question remained: how would the city respond once the full truth emerged? By mid-June, the sheriff had compiled a detailed map of participants, ritual schedules, financial transactions, and psychological control mechanisms. Each layer confirmed that Street Anne's horrors had been deliberate, organized, and maintained through fear, wealth, and twisted theology. The final piece of the puzzle emerged when Clara and Elizabeth recounted a private event just weeks before the poisonings. The priest had summoned them alone, instructing them to prepare for a cleansing night, where certain men would be punished or reminded of their place. Though vague, this confirmed a pattern of premeditated manipulation. Johns understood that the April 9 poisonings were not random. They were a rupture in a carefully controlled system, an unintentional liberation orchestrated by the oppressed rather than an act of justice by the authorities. The women's actions, whether intentional or spontaneous, had ended years of hidden suffering. By the end of Part 7, Sheriff Johns faced a moral and legal dilemma. The evidence was undeniable. The surviving members were guilty of complicity, indoctrination, and abuse. The priest's theological justification had failed with his death. Clara, Elizabeth, and the other women were free, but the city's elite were still entrenched in power. The coming weeks would test the limits of justice, secrecy, and societal morality. Tallahassee was on the edge of revelation, and what happened next would determine whether the city could survive its own sins. I can continue with Part 8, where the investigation begins targeting the remaining surviving men, their families, and the strategies Johns uses to bring the full scope of the crimes to light. Do you want me to continue with Part 8? Title: The Secret Beneath Street. Anne's, Part 8, Engaging Hook. Tallahassee had already faced 14 sudden deaths and the shocking revelations about the priest and his secret gatherings, but the truth was far from over. Sheriff Jefferson Johns now stood at the crossroads of justice and chaos, preparing to confront the surviving men whose power, wealth, and influence had shielded them for years. What unfolded next would shake the city to its foundations and reveal the hidden corruption of an entire community. Part 8, Confronting the Survivors. By mid-July 1852, Sheriff Jefferson Johns had gathered enough evidence to confront the surviving members of the Tallahassee Gentlemen's Club. 15 men remained alive, each deeply implicated in the horrors that had taken place at St. Anne's Church over the previous 2 years. They were prominent figures, farmers, merchants, lawyers, and professionals, men whose reputations had allowed the operation to continue unchecked. Johns knew that public exposure would devastate families, ruin businesses, and spark outrage across the state. He decided on a controlled approach, summoning each man individually under the pretense of routine questioning about the poisonings. Once inside the sheriff's office, the interrogations began. In earnest. The first man was Richard Porter, the tobacco farmer and the only survivor of the April 9 poisoning. Porter, pale and visibly shaken, repeated his account of the night, explaining how he had fled as the men began dying. Johns listened carefully, recording every detail, noting inconsistencies, and cross-referencing his testimony with other evidence. Porter's cooperation would be crucial in establishing the events of that night. One by one, the remaining men were summoned. The responses varied. Some denied involvement, insisting they had only attended innocuous social gatherings. Others admitted participation but claimed ignorance of the horrors hidden within the annex. A few attempted to bribe the sheriff or offer promises of relocation to avoid exposure. Johns recorded all statements meticulously, aware that these confessions could be used in court. It soon became clear that the level of complicity differed among the men. Some had been deeply involved in organizing the gatherings, monitoring compliance, and enforcing rules. Others had been passive participants, observing rituals and abuse but never directly contributing. Still, all had benefited financially or socially from the arrangement. Johns turned his attention to the teenagers who had attended the gatherings with their fathers. The investigation revealed that young boys had been intentionally exposed to the operation, learning to normalize abuse and hierarchy. Interviews with the surviving women confirmed that fathers had brought sons to participate in ceremonies, subtly instructing them in obedience, control, and participation in future gatherings. The sheriff faced a dilemma. Prosecuting these men publicly could destroy the city, while inaction would allow the cycle of abuse to continue. Johns convened a confidential meeting with trusted advisors, including a visiting judge and 2 clerics from neighboring counties. Together, they outlined a strategy for justice that balanced legal accountability with social stability. The first step was securing the surviving women and ensuring their safety. Clara, Elizabeth, Molly, Hannah, and Joanna were moved to a safe location outside Tallahassee. Protective measures included relocation, new identities, and ongoing support from sympathetic community members. Their testimonies would form the backbone of the investigation. Johns also began tracing financial transactions. Many of the surviving men had attempted to obscure payments, hide receipts, or manipulate ledger entries. Careful analysis revealed direct transfers to church accounts, coded payments for participation, and purchases of goods explicitly linked to the annex gatherings. Each transaction further solidified evidence of complicity. The sheriff then began pressuring surviving men with a combination of psychological tactics and legal threats. He confronted them with irrefutable evidence, ledger entries, letters, testimonies from women, and physical proof from the annex. Some men broke immediately, confessing fully. Others resisted, claiming coercion, ignorance, or fear. Yet even denials were recorded, forming a complete picture of who had known, participated, or facilitated the horrors. As confessions accumulated, a pattern of influence emerged. Certain men had acted as intermediaries, recruiting new participants, arranging transportation, and maintaining secrecy. Others had acted as enforcers, ensuring that women complied and younger attendees learned obedience. The network was highly organized, almost corporate in structure. One particularly chilling confession came from a local lawyer. He admitted that he had drafted documents to cover up the priest's activities, intentionally falsifying parish records, and advising men on how to protect themselves. Legally, his involvement highlighted the depth of corruption and the lengths to which the network had gone to remain invisible. Meanwhile, the investigation extended beyond Tallahassee. Letters and financial documents revealed connections with families and influential figures in nearby counties. The priest's teachings and rituals had been distributed to other locations, suggesting that the operation's reach was more extensive than initially believed. Johns realized that a full reckoning might not be possible within city limits alone. Amid the confessions, Sheriff Johns faced pressure from city officials, wealthy families, and the public. Rumors of a cover-up swirled. Some citizens demanded harsh public trials, while others pleaded for discretion to protect social stability. Johns had to navigate both justice and diplomacy carefully. In private sessions, the surviving men were informed of potential legal consequences. Charges included conspiracy, abuse, complicity in death, and human trafficking. Many reacted with fear, realizing that exposure would not only destroy their lives but also implicate families, businesses, and associates. Some begged for leniency, offering full cooperation in exchange for reduced punishment. The sheriff also made strategic use of the letters and diaries he had recovered. Certain entries directly implicated men in orchestrating the April 9 poisonings, while others documented years of planning, ritualized abuse, and financial gain. These documents became central to the strategy, a careful combination of confession, documentation, and moral pressure to achieve accountability without destabilizing the city entirely. By the end of Part 8, Sheriff Johns had achieved significant progress. Every surviving member of the Tallahassee Gentlemen's Club had been identified, interviewed, and pressured to confess. The financial, social, and psychological networks behind Street Ann's horrors had been mapped. The surviving women were safe, and evidence was secure for future legal proceedings. Yet the city's moral reckoning had only begun. The revelations exposed not just individual guilt but the complicity of an entire community in allowing horror to continue unchecked. Families had protected secrets, clergy had justified abuse, and society had normalized obedience over justice. Johns knew the coming months would test the city's courage, integrity, and willingness to confront its own darkness. Tallahassee faced a choice: bury the truth and preserve appearances, or confront the full horror that had operated in its shadows for years. I can continue with Part 9, where the legal proceedings begin, exposing the surviving members publicly, the community reacts, and hidden alliances crumble. Do you want me to continue with Part 9? Title: The Secret Beneath Street Ann's, Part 9, Engaging Hook. Tallahassee had survived poisonings, confessions, and the unraveling of a secret society that had operated in the shadows for years, but the city's true test was just beginning. With the surviving men of the Tallahassee Gentlemen's Club exposed, the community faced its most difficult choice: justice or silence. The coming weeks would reveal not only who had orchestrated horror, but whether a city built on faith and respect could survive its own sins. Part 9: Justice and Chaos. By late August 1852, the legal machinery in Tallahassee was ready to move. Sheriff Jefferson Johns had spent weeks compiling testimonies, documents, ledgers, and letters, building a mountain of evidence against the surviving members of the Tallahassee Gentlemen's Club. 15 men, each wealthy, influential, and tied deeply to the city's economy, were now facing public exposure for crimes that ranged from abuse and conspiracy to complicity in the deaths of 14 men and years of enslaved suffering. The courthouse was packed the morning the indictments were read. Citizens filled the benches, journalists scribbled notes, and distant relatives of the deceased waited, some in silent shock, others openly weeping. For years, Tallahassee had lived with whispers, with rumors carefully hidden behind respectability. Now, the secrets were exposed under the unforgiving light of law and public scrutiny. Judge Alistair Green presided. A man of stern expression and unwavering principle, he recognized the extraordinary weight of the case. If handled poorly, it could tear the city apart. If handled with courage, it might finally confront the festering corruption that had thrived in shadows. He called the first witness, Clara, one of the former church slaves. Clara's testimony was meticulous, each word deliberate. She described the gatherings at St. Anne's Annex, the chained women, the instruments of abuse, and the rituals justified by twisted interpretations of Scripture. She spoke of men she had seen before and after each night, how they paid, how they controlled, and how they normalized terror. Her voice quivered occasionally, but she did not break. Next, Elizabeth recounted her own experiences, the pregnancies, the disappearance of infants, and the power the priest held over both the women and the men who attended. Every detail chipped away at the veneer of civility the surviving men had relied upon. The court listened in stunned silence as stories emerged of children being indoctrinated, wives kept in ignorance, and entire families living beside unspeakable crimes without knowledge or suspicion. The first man called to testify in his own defense was Richard Porter, the lone survivor of the April 9 poisonings. Porter's account was carefully calibrated, revealing his presence but distancing himself from direct participation in abuses he had witnessed. Still, he confirmed details that matched the women's stories. His testimony was enough to confirm timelines, sequences, and the method of arsenic poisoning that had killed 14 men. The surviving members of the club sat in the defendant's box, faces pale and tight with tension. Some shifted uncomfortably under the gaze of citizens they had once considered peers, others avoided eye contact entirely. Their wealth and social standing could no longer shield them. Every ledger, letter, and receipt from Father Reed's collection became evidence, each note, each coded payment, proof of calculated participation. Legal experts argued over charges. Some suggested capital punishment for those directly responsible for the poisonings, while others recommended lengthy sentences for complicity in the systematic abuse of enslaved women. The case became a moral as well as legal trial. Tallahassee had to confront the reality that its leaders, men who had preached virtue, conducted business, and led families, had participated in horrors that would horrify the nation. In private, Sheriff Johns coordinated witness protection and arranged for the women and surviving children to testify safely. Their identities were carefully shielded, though the press reported enough to spark outrage. Tallahassee's streets buzzed with conversation. Many citizens demanded swift justice, while others whispered in disbelief, unable to reconcile the image of respected men with the crimes they had committed. The courtroom became a theater of tension. Each confession, each corroborated account, tore at the fabric of the community. Some men, under pressure, admitted full participation in abuse, explaining how they had been led by social expectation and the priest's authority. Others attempted to deflect responsibility, claiming ignorance or coercion. Judge Green allowed no delay. The scale of evidence was overwhelming. Outside the courthouse, citizens gathered in protest. Posters naming the victims appeared, along with demands for accountability. Families of the dead attended every hearing, insisting that the law acknowledge not just their husbands, fathers, and sons, but also the women and children whose suffering had been concealed. Meanwhile, the press ran scathing editorials. Newspapers in Jacksonville, Tallahassee, and surrounding counties published detailed accounts of the proceedings. The public could no longer ignore the depth of depravity that had existed within their city's most respected circles. National attention began to focus on Tallahassee, framing it as a cautionary tale of unchecked power, religious manipulation, and societal complicity. Back in the courthouse, evidence of the priest's theological justifications horrified attendees. Pages from his diaries were read aloud, passages twisting scripture to rationalize abuse. Witnesses confirmed private sermons where women were forced to kneel and recite distorted biblical passages. The court learned of how men had been trained to perceive suffering and control as sacred duties, creating a culture of normalized horror. The legal proceedings stretched into weeks. Many surviving club members pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for testimony against others. The system of secrecy that had once protected them began to crumble under the weight of evidence and moral outrage. Families and business partners scrambled to distance themselves from those convicted. During recess, Sheriff Johns walked the streets, witnessing the mix of fear, outrage, and disbelief. He knew the community would never fully recover its innocence, but he also recognized a turning point. Justice, delayed but inevitable, had begun. The women and children, once voiceless and trapped, were finally gaining agency. As Part 9 closed, Tallahassee faced a city forever changed. The surviving members of the Tallahassee Gentlemen's Club were now public figures marked by disgrace. The priest was dead, but his legacy of horror and manipulation remained, a reminder that corruption could hide behind faith and respectability. The question now was what would happen to the final pieces of the network, and whether true justice could ever fully repair the damage. If you want, I can immediately continue with Part 10, the explosive conclusion, revealing the ultimate fate of the survivors, the remaining secrets, and the city's reckoning. Do you want me to do that next? Title: The Secret Beneath Street. Ann's, Part 10, Final Chapter. Engaging hook. Tallahassee had been scarred by poisonings, conspiracies, and years of hidden horrors at St. Anne's Church. Families were shattered, respected men disgraced, and the city forced to confront a truth no one wanted to face. But even after trials, confessions, and exposure, one question remained: could justice ever truly reach the depths of what had happened? The final chapter reveals the shocking fate of those involved and the chilling legacy left behind. Part 10, Reckoning and Legacy. The courthouse was quieter than usual on the first day of the final hearings. Judge Alistair Green, aware that this trial had already shaken Tallahassee to its core, opened the session with a solemn reminder. He stressed the weight of evidence, the lives destroyed, and the responsibility of the court to deliver justice fairly, despite public pressure. The last surviving members of the Tallahassee Gentlemen's Club faced the courtroom. 15 men who once commanded respect now appeared diminished and fearful. Their wealth and social status could no longer shield them. Each confession, corroborated by testimony from Clara, Elizabeth, and Richard Porter, had left little doubt of their participation in abuses, conspiracies, and complicity in the deaths of 14 men. The focus shifted to Clara and Elizabeth, who had been hidden for safety until this day. Their courage in recounting events provided clarity about the final night of April 9, 1852, and revealed how meticulously the club operated over 2 years. The court heard of arsenic-laced whiskey, private sermons justifying abuse, and the chilling indoctrination of teenage boys into this corrupt system. As the proceedings continued, the stories of Father Prescott Reed's theological distortions shocked the city further. Pages from his diaries were read aloud, verses twisted to rationalize oppression, slavery, and abuse. The priest had transformed moral authority into chains of terror, making men feel righteous even as they committed atrocities. His death did not end the horror, it merely exposed it. Legal experts debated charges, carefully separating murder from complicity, abuse, and economic exploitation. The surviving club members faced sentences ranging from years in prison to permanent exile. Families of the deceased pressed for the harshest punishments, demanding that the law recognize not just the poisonings but the systematic abuse of women and children. The courtroom also revealed a dark financial dimension. Ledgers showed how Father Reed had profited from the operation, charging men for participation, placing premiums on pregnant women, and creating a market built on fear and suffering. Arsenic, alcohol, and control had become tools of wealth, and the surviving members had knowingly contributed to a system of exploitation. Meanwhile, Catherine and Agnes, the prostitutes who had disappeared on the night of the poisonings, were never located. Authorities speculated they had fled to avoid involvement in murders they had witnessed. Their absence became a lingering mystery, a reminder that some horrors escape justice entirely. Outside the courthouse, public anger grew. Crowds demanded visibility into the investigation, insisting that no influential figure escape accountability. Editors of local newspapers used every available detail to publish articles exposing the network. Tallahassee was forced to confront the truth: its respected men had betrayed the very community they claimed to lead. As verdicts were delivered, sentences varied. Some men received life imprisonment. Others, facing public shame and pressure from family, were exiled from the state. A few who cooperated fully with the investigation were given leniency but stripped of wealth, property, and social standing. For all, reputations were destroyed. The women, though still traumatized, gained a degree of agency. Clara and Elizabeth were granted freedom, protection, and compensation from the assets seized from the church and the club members. Their resilience became a symbol for the city, a painful but vital acknowledgement that justice could still offer hope, even amid profound suffering. Judge Green issued a final statement in court, emphasizing that Tallahassee's moral reckoning had just begun. The city would have to address not only the acts themselves but the culture that allowed corruption to flourish. Silence, deference to authority, and complicity had made the horror possible. Green called upon citizens to remain vigilant, warning that evil thrives where accountability is absent. The aftermath of the trial transformed Tallahassee. The church property at St. Anne's was seized and eventually converted into a public institution focused on education and community service. Records of the Tallahassee Gentlemen's Club became historical documents, studied as cautionary lessons about power, secrecy, and moral compromise. Families of the deceased, though never fully healed, received some solace in knowing the truth had been revealed. Children like the teenage boys who had been present during club gatherings grew up under the weight of what they had witnessed, but with guidance to reject the corrupt legacy they had seen. Yet even years later, stories persisted. Locals whispered of hidden chambers, unexplored attics, and corners of the city where secrets might still linger. The events at St. Anne's became a reminder: horror can hide behind respectability, and faith can be twisted to justify evil. As historians and journalists documented the case, it became clear that Tallahassee had learned a painful truth: evil often thrives in silence, and justice requires courage from those willing to confront it, no matter the personal cost. The city would remember the 14 dead, the suffering endured by Clara, Elizabeth, and others, and the long shadow of Father Reed's twisted authority. By the time the courthouse doors closed, Tallahassee had changed forever. Families rebuilt, laws strengthened, citizens became more vigilant. The story of the Tallahassee Gentlemen's Club became a historical lesson on corruption, morality, and human responsibility. It served as a warning that evil thrives where complicity is tolerated, and that courage and truth are the only forces capable of confronting it. The legacy of St. Anne's haunted the city, but it also reminded future generations that silence is never neutral. Accountability, transparency, and moral courage are the tools needed to prevent history from repeating its darkest chapters. Call to action: if this story shocked you and left you wanting more, don't forget to subscribe, share with your friends, and leave a comment telling us what you think. Tallahassee's secrets may be in the past, but the lessons are timeless.